My mom and her new family move in with me in the house I inherited from my dad, and they plotted to take it. But what happened next left them in tears. 3 months ago, I, a 24-year-old male, moved out of my old apartment and into a house that my father left me. My father passed away 6 months ago from a cardiac arrest at the age of 47, and I inherited the house he used to live in. It's in a nice neighborhood, much more spacious than my old apartment, and conveniently located near my workplace, making it perfect for me. I've been living here for nearly 3 months. As I mentioned earlier, about 6 weeks ago, my mother, a 46-year-old woman, reached out to ask if she and her family could move in with me for a while. I agreed because she told me they were on the verge of homelessness and needed a place to stay immediately. They'd been living in a motel for 2 weeks, but they couldn't continue because they were running low on cash. So, I let them move in temporarily until their problems were sorted out. Her husband had lost his job due to downsizing, where he and several other employees were laid off without notice about a month ago. My mother is a stay-at-home mom, so they didn't have much saved for emergencies like this. They couldn't pay their rent on time and were asked to vacate the house they'd been living in. As a result, my mother, her husband, and their 2 children moved in with me. My house has 3 bedrooms, so I was okay with giving up 2 of them, one for my mother and her husband, and the other for the kids, a 12-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy. My parents got divorced when I was 8 years old. They just weren't compatible and fought constantly about petty things. Eventually, they decided it would be better to part ways. The only reason they married so young was because my mother was pregnant with me, and there was a lot of pressure from their families to get married before I was born. So, they did exactly that, but they were young and didn't really want to be together. Once I was at a reasonable age, they divorced and had joint custody of me. I alternated between living with my mom and my dad throughout the year, and I had a good relationship with both of them growing up. That's part of why I didn't think twice about helping my mother out by letting her move in when she was in trouble. But I regret it now. My parents hadn't stayed in touch over the years, as far as I know. They had very different personalities that clashed a lot, and I knew they couldn't understand each other because of how stiff and awkward they were whenever they spoke or met at my school events. Once I turned 18, they no longer needed to co-parent me and stopped speaking to each other altogether. By then, my mother had remarried and had 2 children. She got married 3 years after the divorce to her current husband and had my half-siblings with him. The age gap between me and my half-siblings was huge, so I wasn't particularly close to them growing up. I couldn't really play or have fun with them, which is what kids my age wanted. I mean, I must have been 12 when my mother's eldest daughter was born, and at that age, a newborn baby wasn't very interesting to me. I was never close to my mother's husband either, and didn't refer to him as my stepdad. I called him by his name because thinking of him as my father, when I already had such a wonderful dad, felt weird and wrong. So, no, I'm not very close to my mother's family. The only reason I let them move in was for my mother's sake. My father never remarried or had other children. When I wasn't living with, he'd either be working or traveling because that's what he loved. My mother didn't know that my dad had left this house to me. After she moved in, she was impressed that I'd been able to afford such a nice house at my age, so I told her that I'd inherited it from my dad. She knew her ex-husband had passed away and had even attended his funeral, but she hadn't asked about my inheritance, so I'd never told her. It had honestly slipped my mind. When I did tell her, it was quite conversational, and I didn't think much of it. She didn't have much of a reaction either, so there was no way I could have foreseen what was coming. My mother and her family had been living here for a little over a month, and I was getting agitated because they showed no signs of moving out anytime soon. They had made themselves quite at home. Her husband insisted he was looking for a new job, but kept saying we were in a recession, so things would take time. He promised they'd be out of my hair as soon as he found another job. I tried not to bring it up often, but it was difficult because, since turning 18, I'd gotten used to living by myself and having the house to myself. This was a bit of an inconvenience, but I tried my best not to make them feel bad about it. Then, last week, my mother sat me down after the kids had gone to sleep and said she and her husband had something important to tell me. I thought they finally had good news to share, but instead, she informed me that she'd spoken to a lawyer and decided to contest my father's will. She told me I had to vacate the house because she believed the property was rightfully hers.
Why did she believe that?
Because she'd supported my dad in the early days of his career by sacrificing her own to raise me and tend to the house while he worked. She felt she was owed the house since she hadn't asked for much in the divorce settlement. She thought this would be fitting repayment. She'd already filed a petition to contest the will and told me I'd be served in a few days. She wanted to give me a heads up so I wouldn't be blindsided and advised me to start looking for a new home. I was livid when she told me what she'd done. I'd been helping her for the past 6 weeks by letting her stay here, and this was how she repaid me, by trying to get me kicked out of my own house. I had no idea how to react, and my first instinct was to panic because there was a real chance I could lose the house to my mother. I didn't want that because I'd grown attached to it. It reminded me of my dad since I'd visited him here sometimes, and those were good memories. He'd only purchased this house 3 or 4 years ago, and it was in beautiful condition. It was a perfect fit for me, so I didn't want my mother to take it away. At that point, I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and that I'd make sure she was the one evicted soon enough. I told her she'd better start looking for a place to live. Then I stormed off to my room, slammed the door shut, and called my dad's lawyer to discuss this. He had handled the divorce and the will, so I knew he'd have the answers about whether my mother could do this. My dad's lawyer informed me that her claim of not asking for much in the divorce settlement was completely untrue. She had received almost $80,000 in the settlement and alimony payments, which is a lot, and definitely not much, as she had claimed. She could try to contest the will, but the lawyer reassured me that it was unlikely she'd stand a chance in court. She hadn't spoken to my dad or kept in touch with him after the divorce, had remarried, and had kids with another man, so her claim would likely be dismissed almost immediately. Legally, I had nothing to worry about, which was a relief. But I was still furious that my mother had tried to pull a fast one on me just because I'd been kind enough to support her and her family. I was being kind, not stupid. The next morning, before the kids were awake, I decided to confront my mother and tell her she couldn't live here anymore. It was early, probably 5 or 6 in the morning, and she was taken aback and disoriented when I woke her up. I told her to pack up and get out of my house, or I'd call the cops and have them escorted out, which wouldn't be pretty for any of them. She argued, saying the house was as much hers as mine and that in a few weeks it would be completely hers, which was laughable. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. I told her time would tell if that was true, but for now, the house was entirely mine, and she had 0 rights over it. She needed to leave, or I'd make her leave. She and her husband thought I was bluffing, pushed me out of the room, locked themselves inside, and refused to leave. So, I did exactly what I promised. I called the police, reported them for trespassing, and had them legally removed from my property. I felt bad for the kids, but I'd had enough of my mother and her husband, and I couldn't take it anymore. When the cops arrived, they tried to reason with me and begged me to let them stay, but it was too little, too late. I'd seen their true colors, and I wasn't going to let them stick around and make things worse. They had to leave, and they had to leave immediately. My mother was cursing at me even as she packed some of her clothes and the kids' stuff, but it didn't change my mind. Thankfully, they'd only brought clothes and no furniture, and they'd been sleeping on foldable beds, so they were done quickly. Soon enough, they were gone, and I was back to living on my own. Ever since that incident, my mother has been texting me every day to convince me to take them back in. She even stopped the proceedings to contest the will to avoid further complications. I managed to ignore her for a while, but last night she told me they were really low on money and couldn't afford to live at a motel anymore. They were desperately in need of a place to live and asked me to take them back in, just for the sake of the kids. I told her I'd be willing to take the kids in, but she and her husband couldn't come back. She flipped out, called me heartless and cruel, said I deserved to go to hell for how I was treating them, and then disconnected the call. I've been feeling very guilty about not letting my mother stay with me. I felt terrible for my half-siblings, but if my mother didn't want to let them live with me, there was little I could do. I haven't heard from my mother or her husband since that last phone call, and I'm concerned they're probably homeless now, which is really sad. But they honestly brought this on themselves. I can't imagine why my mother felt entitled enough to demand that I vacate my own house and look for somewhere else to live. She never had anything nice to say about my dad after they separated and hardly spoke to him when he was alive. So, to say that she felt he owed her this house was an insane statement, and she even acted on it by contesting the will. Likely she assumed I'd just transfer ownership to her without questioning because she's my mother. I would have loved to help her out during a time when she needed it, just as she'd done for me throughout my childhood, but not at the cost of myself. The presence of my mother's family in my home, though initially an act of compassion, quickly became a source of frustration. Her husband, who had lost his job to corporate downsizing, seemed to settle into a troubling complacency after I allowed them to move in. He would assure me he was actively seeking employment, yet his days were spent lounging on the couch, a cigarette in hand, his attention glued to the television screen. It was as though he believed he could afford such leisure, as if time were not pressing against their precarious situation. I held my tongue, not wanting to stir conflict, but I repeatedly urged my mother to address his inertia. Their stay in my home was never meant to be permanent, and I hoped she could nudge him toward action. But she, too, adopted a passive stance. dismissing my concerns with vague assurances that things would resolve when they were meant to. Their laid-back attitude baffled me. How could they remain so unhurried in the face of such dire circumstances? It was no wonder they had spiraled into this crisis, their lack of urgency a stark contrast to the gravity of their predicament. My heart ached for my half-siblings, a 12-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy, who were innocent bystanders in this mess. They bore no responsibility for their parents' choices, yet they endured the brunt of the consequences. Uprooted from their home, their stability shattered. The weight of their suffering gnawed at me. It had been nearly 4 days since my last conversation with my mother, and the silence left me uneasy. I hoped she had found a new place to live, as the thought of her family adrift kept me awake at night. Despite her flaws, her audacity in attempting to claim my house, her betrayal of my trust, she remained my mother. A part of me rooted in a sense of duty and humanity yearned for her and her children to find safety and security. But I was resolute. I would not allow her back into my home, not after she tried to strip me of what was rightfully mine. If she wished, I would take in the children and arrange for their care, but that was the extent of my willingness to help. The choice was hers. If she wanted my support for the kids, she could reach out. If not, I would respect her decision, though it pained me to think of their plight. 2 weeks passed without a word from her, and I had begun to push the matter to the back of my mind, focusing instead on reclaiming the peace of my home. Then, unexpectedly, her husband called. His voice carried a weary edge as he asked if I could lend them some money. My immediate instinct was caution. I had no intention of handing over funds without understanding his intentions. When I pressed him for details, he explained that he planned to take my mother and the children to his brother's home, a few towns away. The money was for bus tickets, he said, promising to repay me as soon as he could. I was skeptical. He had never contributed to the electricity bills during their stay, and I doubted his promise of repayment. Yet, I am not one to harbor grudges, and I believe in extending a hand to those in need even if their actions have caused me pain. I have been fortunate, blessed with more than enough to sustain myself, and lending them the money would not diminish my own stability. So, I agreed, driven by a sense of compassion that outweighed my reservations. He added, almost as an afterthought, that my mother, though too proud to admit it, wanted to see me one last time before they left the city. She hadn't reached out herself, her silence a testament to the rift between us. Still, I decided to visit her at the motel, not out of obligation but as a final gesture of closure. I wasn't sorry for standing my ground. Evicting them had been necessary to protect my home, but I was the only one offering them help in their darkest hour. I expected at the very least a shred of gratitude, even if her pride made it difficult to express. The meeting at the motel was heavy with emotion, a collision of unresolved tensions and fleeting moments of reconciliation. I sent them money for their bus fare, along with a little extra, just before arriving. My mother's husband greeted me, his appearance haggard, his words sparse. He led me to their room and quietly took the children to the lobby, giving my mother and me a moment to speak alone. Her demeanor was initially cold, her thank you curt, as though the words were forced through a veil of resentment. I responded with a simple "you're welcome," ready to leave, assuming that was the extent of our exchange. But as I turned to go, she stopped me, her voice softening. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she apologized for her attempt to take my house, to displace me from the home my father had left me. She admitted it was a foolish, desperate act, driven not by entitlement but by her fear for her children's future. She knew my father owed her nothing, and the house was rightfully mine, yet her desperation had clouded her judgment. Her words stirred a complex mix of emotions within me. I was relieved to hear her take accountability, yet the sting of her betrayal lingered. I had opened my home to her family out of kindness, only to face her audacity in trying to claim it. The house was more than just a place to live. It was a connection to my father, a man whose memory I cherished deeply. Losing it would have been like losing a piece of him, a wound I wasn't prepared to bear. Yet, standing there in that cramped motel room, I saw not just the woman who had wronged me, but a mother grappling with the weight of her choices, fighting to provide for her children. Her apology didn't erase the past, but it softened the edges of my anger, offering a glimpse of the humanity beneath her mistakes. Reflecting on this ordeal, I found myself wrestling with the boundaries of compassion and self-preservation. My mother's family had tested those boundaries, pushing me to confront the limits of my generosity. Her husband's inertia frustrated me, a stark contrast to the urgency their situation demanded. I saw in him a man who had once carried himself with pride, now reduced to a shadow of his former self, his days spent in idle distraction. My mother, too, seemed to have surrendered to a fatalistic outlook, her assurances of destiny a weak excuse for inaction. Their approach to life, carefree to the point of recklessness, had landed them in this crisis, and I couldn't help but wonder how they had let things unravel so completely. The children, however, remained my anchor in this storm of conflicting emotions. They were blameless, their bright spirits dimmed by circumstances beyond their control. I remembered their laughter during their brief stay in my home, the way they navigated the chaos with a resilience that humbled me. When they were born, I was too young to form a bond, too caught up in my own adolescent world to care for a newborn or a toddler. But living with them, even for a short time, had changed that. I saw their potential, their curiosity, their capacity for joy despite the instability around them. They deserved better than to be pawns in their parents' struggles, and that conviction drove my decision to help, even after everything. I thought about the broader implications of this experience. Family is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of love, duty, and, at times, betrayal. My mother's actions had frayed that tapestry, but I couldn't bring myself to cut it entirely. Her husband, flawed as he was, didn't deserve to be cast out into the abyss of homelessness, nor did the children deserve to suffer for their parents' mistakes. By lending them the money, I wasn't just helping my mother's family, I was honoring a deeper principle. A belief that compassion, even when tested, is a cornerstone of humanity. I couldn't let those children face the uncertainty of foster care, not when I had the means to help them find a safer path. The meeting with my mother marked a tentative step toward closure, though not reconciliation. Our relationship remained strained, our conversations brief and cautious, limited to updates about her new life, the children's adjustment, and my own routine. We avoid the deeper wounds, the unspoken questions about whether we can ever rebuild what was lost. For now, I'm at peace with the distance between us. The house, my father's legacy, remains my sanctuary, a place where I can reflect on the lessons of this ordeal. I acted with both strength and compassion, protecting what was mine while extending a hand to those in need. As I move forward, I carry the weight of this experience, a reminder that family ties, though fraught, are not easily severed. The conversation with my mother at the motel left me with a complex mix of emotions. I was relieved to hear her acknowledge the gravity of her actions, admitting that her attempt to contest my father's will and claim my house was a grave misstep. Her apology carried a weight of sincerity, and I could sense her regret. I made it clear, however, that this financial assistance, lending her the money for their relocation, was a one-time gesture. I emphasized that she and her husband should not expect further support, as I could not allow this to become a recurring obligation. She nodded in agreement, her expression a blend of resignation and gratitude. She shared that within a day or two they planned to board a bus to her husband's brother's home, where they would start anew. Her husband's brother owned a poultry farm, a far cry from the kind of work her husband once aspired to. He had resisted the idea of joining the family business, perhaps clinging to a sense of pride or a hope for something more prestigious. But circumstances had left them with no other viable path forward. The children, my half-siblings, a 12-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy, were struggling with the prospect of leaving their friends behind. I could empathize with their heartache. At their age, friendships are the cornerstone of one's world, and uprooting that stability is no small thing. Yet, as I reflected on it, I knew this was simply the harsh reality of life's unpredictability. My mother expressed deep gratitude for her brother-in-law's kindness in welcoming them into his home and offering her husband a role in the family business. For the first time in a while, she spoke with a glimmer of optimism, a hope that this move might offer her family a chance to rebuild. She handed me the address of their new home, inviting me to visit if I ever felt inclined, though she was careful not to press the issue. Given the recent turmoil, barely 3 weeks had passed since I had them removed from my home, the gesture felt tentative, almost fragile. The memory of that confrontation still lingered, making the passage of time feel distorted, as though months, not weeks, had elapsed. The weight of their struggles pressed heavily on my mind. My mother, nearing 50, was navigating a crisis that would test anyone's resilience. The instability of homelessness, the strain of financial hardship, and the responsibility of caring for 2 young children who were not yet teenagers made her situation profoundly challenging. Those children, bright and full of life, were caught in the crossfire of their parents' misfortunes, witnessing struggles no child should have to endure. I found myself grappling with the decision to lend them money, fully aware that some might view it as a sign of weakness or naivety, especially after my mother's betrayal. Critics might argue that I was too soft, too easily swayed by familial ties or a sense of duty, but my motivations were rooted in something deeper than obligation. It was the children who tugged at my heart. When they were born, I was too young to form a meaningful connection with them, barely a teenager myself, caught up in my own world. But having lived with them for over a month, I came to know their personalities, their laughter, their small quirks. They were vibrant, hopeful, and undeserving of the chaos that had engulfed their lives. My mother's actions had been egregious. She tried to take my home, a place that held not just physical comfort, but emotional ties to my late father. Yet despite her betrayal, I couldn't bring myself to abandon her family entirely. Even her husband, whose laziness frustrated me to no end, didn't deserve the humiliation of this downfall. I remembered him from years past, a man who once carried himself with a degree of dignity. To see him now, reduced to asking for financial help, was jarring. It wasn't just about their connection to me, it was about their humanity. The thought of those children facing the uncertainty of foster care was unbearable. I wasn't in a position to take them in permanently, but I could offer this small act of support to ensure they had a chance at stability. By providing the money for their bus tickets and a little extra, I felt I had done what was right, not just for them, but for my own peace of mind. Knowing I had helped even in a small way allowed me to rest easier, confident that I had acted with integrity. A week later, my mother sent a message confirming that they had settled into her brother-in-law's home. The transition was abrupt and challenging, as such upheavals often are, but they were doing their best to adapt. The children, she said, were caught between the pain of missing their friends and the novelty of their new surroundings, where they could chase chickens and explore the rural landscape. It was heartening to hear that they were finding moments of joy amidst the upheaval, their resilience shining through in the way only children can manage. I felt a quiet sense of pride, knowing that my contribution had made this fresh start possible. It wasn't about seeking recognition or gratitude, it was about knowing I had made a tangible difference in their lives, however small. My relationship with my mother remained strained, a delicate thread stretched thin by the events of the past few weeks. Our conversations are brief, rarely lasting more than 2 or 3 minutes. We stick to safe topics, her adjustment to the new home, how the children are coping, and updates about my work. There's an unspoken agreement to avoid revisiting the pain of our recent conflict. I don't know if we'll ever fully mend what's been broken. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of her actions, but because it revealed a side of her I hadn't fully understood. Yet, I hold on to a sliver of hope that time might soften the edges of our rift. For now, I'm content with the distance between us, a space that allows me to process my emotions without the weight of her presence. Reflecting on the broader arc of this experience, I find myself wrestling with the balance between compassion and self-preservation. Letting my mother and her family into my home was an act of kindness, born of a desire to help someone in need, especially someone tied to me by blood. But her attempt to claim my inheritance forced me to confront the limits of that kindness. Evicting them was not an easy decision. It was born of necessity, a line I drew to protect what was rightfully mine. Yet even after that, I couldn't fully turn away when they faced further hardship. This duality, standing firm in my boundaries while still extending a hand, has been a defining tension in this chapter of my life. The house itself, a gift from my father, remains a sanctuary, a tangible connection to his memory. Its walls hold echoes of the time we spent together, moments of laughter and quiet conversations that I cherish deeply. Losing it would have meant losing a piece of him, a prospect that fueled my resolve to fight my mother's claim. The legal reassurance from my father's lawyer was a relief, but the emotional toll of the conflict lingered. It wasn't just about property, it was about trust, family, and the delicate balance of obligation and autonomy. As I move forward, I carry a mix of emotions: relief that my mother and her family have a place to go, sorrow for the children caught in this mess, and a cautious hope for what lies ahead. I don't know if I'll visit them at the poultry farm. The invitation is there, but the wounds are still fresh, and I need time to heal. For now, I'm focusing on my own life, reclaiming the peace of my home, and reflecting on the lessons this ordeal has taught me. It's been nearly a week since they left the city, and while the future is uncertain, I find comfort in knowing I acted with both strength and compassion. Whatever comes next, I'll face it with the same resolve that carried me through this storm.